It's my pleasure to introduce Parnell McGuinness. Parnell is a newspaper columnist, an experienced communication strategist who has developed and delivered big ideas in advertising, communications, advocacy, and media relation campaigns for over 16 years. This is the bit that I like in particular, because I think this augurs for a very interesting afternoon. One of Parnell's favorite lines is, "Well-behaved women don't make history." Very interesting afternoon. In any case, Parnell is going to discuss the third chamber of Parliament, the influence of the media in the 24-hour media cycle. Over to you, Parnell.
I'll start with the traditional unmuting of the Zoom. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. And thank you, Shiva, especially, who encourages me regularly in my writing, and Barbara, who introduced me to this forum in the first place. For an International Women's Day, such a long time ago when we could actually meet in person. Wasn't that exciting? And thank you also to all of the very many people on this call who have contributed with their ideas and thoughts and conversations to my writing. So I really appreciate that, and you each know who you are. To start off with, I just want to take you into a scene. It's a tightly packed chamber, and the men in it, for they are all men, are plump with a sense of their own importance. They're shouting enthusiastically, but it's not a sport match. They're all buttoned up, bound at the neck and besooted, and they're fighting over matters of immense consequence. This is the Parliament of 1787, and one man is on his feet, thundering across the chamber at some of the other men who sit off to the side. Dripping with sarcasm, Edmund Burke rounds on the gentlemen of the press. There are 4 estates in Parliament, but in the reporters' gallery yonder, there sits a 4th estate more important far than they all. And that was the origin of the term the 4th estate, a sarcastic reference to the media which snarks from the peanut gallery at the men of action who selflessly strive to build a better and stronger nation. At least, that's how they like to see it. The truth is, Burke may not have said that at all, but he, like his colleagues and the politicians who came after him, have a complicated relationship with the media, partly fascinated and partly repelled. Politicians since the beginning of time have been more like the press than they'd prefer to think. They often started their political careers tearing into the figures that they would later become with the pen. They start often as journalists themselves, or flattering them with invitations, libations, and fawning words. All of which is to say that the tension between politicians and the press is here to stay. It's a tension of a passionate and not always healthily codependent relationship. I've cheekily called the press a third chamber of Parliament for the purposes of today's conversation, after Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's reasons for rejecting the Indigenous voice to Parliament proposed in the Uluru Statement of the Heart. The truth is, there already was a third chamber of Parliament that was very much active in politics and probably contributed to Turnbull's rejecting the Uluru Statement. And that is the media, which does more than just observe and analyse. As a result, for those of us interested in politics and achieving policy outcomes, it is important to understand the press as it is to understand the processes of politics. The press offers politicians an opportunity to present themselves to the public. And to start with the obvious, the press offers politicians an opportunity to present themselves as persons of influence. This is, of course, the origin of the codependency which politicians develop with the press over the course of their careers. And here's a fun fact. People are actually inclined to like familiar faces better. So the more often they appear in the press, the more they're liked. And you know what? These faces become more attractive. And as we know, a lot of politicians could do with some of that. So presenting in the press makes politicians electable. And when the press says positive things about a politician or political hopeful, they seem more credible in the eyes of their peers and the public. Maybe also more beautiful, but we'll let you be the judge of that. So a political hopeful will spend a lot of time courting the press. And growing up in a journalistic household, as I did, the phone was constantly ringing with politicians wanting to speak to my father. In fact, I think as a teenager, he probably spent more time on the phone than I did. Terrible in the days before mobile phones, when we couldn't both have a line. We also had journalists, we also had politicians visiting their house all the time. One of the scourges of my teenagehood was having Tony Abbott showing up on the balcony of my house on a regular basis. Come up all bleary-eyed and teenage, and there he'd be yakking away with my father at all hours of the morning. So despite the fact that they spend a lot of time chumming up, though, the press and politicians are frequently quite contemptuous of one another. The incisive journalist and satirist H.L. Mencken threw many memorable word spears at politicians. One of my favourites is, a politician is an animal who can sit on a fence and yet keep both ears on the ground. The thing is, journalists often start doing what they do because they like to understand the world. And when you delve into the world energetically, you often find some incompetent person is really making inexplicable mistakes. And most of the time, because this is how politics and policy works, that person is a politician. Luckily, by virtue of his or her chosen profession, a journalist never has to make a better suggestion than the one that has led to the calamity. And as you can imagine, that in itself breeds contempt. The peanut gallery is a very comfortable perch. But they do get to criticise. In fact, the more unforgivingly they platter up the failings of the politician, the better the press is said to have done its job. Politicians, naturally in return, don't have much regard for the hacks who hack them up. I told you about what Edmund Burke said before. Robert Menzies took great pleasure in rubbishing the media too. In launching the ABC in 1962, he said, "Oh, it gives you a nice and pleasant feeling of mastery if you can turn it off and get to another station. This is the highest exercise of citizenship. And indeed, they make it easy for you now because you can do it by remote control, by pressing a button." Former Prime Ministers Rudd and Turnbull are not even engaging in a campaign against News Corp, which they regard as the root of all of their political troubles. Politicians have always wanted to turn off the press. My father and Paul Keating even had a long-running row in which Keating could only get the upper hand by calling him a vitriolic liar with the morals of an alley cat in an article published days after his death. It's one way to get the last word if you can't get it in person. Politicians love the journalists who tell them what they want to hear, though. But they're actually just often busy serving their readers sugar hits with self-righteousness. And that is the danger of journalists who write up positive stories. They are some of the most dangerous journalists for the politicians who they flatter. These journalists can tell wonderful stories about how effective and magnificent the politicians are, who then find themselves walking into an electoral trap, much like the one the ABC created for the Labor Party at the last election, in which they did surveys and told an entire narrative about how the Labor Party could not fail to win. And we all know how that came to pass on the night of the election. It's easy to believe what you want to hear. So that tension worked out badly in that case. The smarter politicians know that the press offers home truths, which their yes men and women don't serve up. I'm personally a big fan of Joe Hildebrand, who writes for news.com.au. He's a die-hard Labor man, but he fronts up again and again to criticise Labor. People must hate him. But why does he do it? Not because he hates the Labor Party, but because he loves it and wants more than anything in this world for the Labor Party to fix itself and become electable. And all those methods apply to policy proposals as well. A journalist who tells you how wonderful a policy proposal is, how it should get up without analysing the content or what could go right or wrong, is actually doing the policy process a massive disfavour. On the other hand, taking a policy proposal apart does have the potential to make it better. In that sense, the press can sometimes be as important or even more important than the Senate, the House of Review through which many of these bills pass. There are many effective ways to achieve a political or policy goal, and one of those is to make a strong and timely argument via the press. But the key is to understand and be comfortable with the idea that you might not make friends through your intervention. On the other hand, the satisfaction is that you may have some impact. You may make things better. And I'm sure you guys understand that. Being involved with Rotary is all about finding different ways to make the world a bit better. The press, as the third chamber of Parliament, can expose bad ideas and support good ideas to ultimately become policy. So in an ideal world, the tension between the press and policymakers is a healthy one and even conducive to better outcomes. But it can break down in a few ways. Politicians are often tempted to treat the people and press like idiots. This is something we've seen during the pandemic, unfortunately, where politicians tried to oversimplify health messaging in the hope that it will make it through the press intact to the people. And then the press often prove themselves idiots too. Rather than try in good faith to communicate important messages to the public, many of the press gallery played politics. Last year, if you'll recall, there was an epidemic of confusion that went along with the pandemic at the beginning, when the press decided it couldn't understand the messaging about school closures. Now, the press was there not providing a service to the people in communicating important messages. The press was playing politics at an incredibly important time. And that's where things can go really wrong. And this year we've seen the media demanding harsher and harsher restrictions rather than try to understand the rationale behind the restrictions. Again, there is a real imperative in the press to try and be part of the story. But when it is not acting as a chamber of review, it is or a means of communication. It's actually stepping away from its duties. We see this also in the role that the press can play in populism. Traditionally, the press is understood as the voice of the people. And often it does play that role. It tries to distill what the wider people feel in order to feed it back. But then we have also come to a situation where poll-driven politics has been adopted by the press as well as the media. The media likes to have polls to report because it's easy. It's a numerical representation of what's happening in the community. It requires very little analysis. Similarly, politicians like to have polls because they suggest what needs to be done or what should be done in order to be elected, but not necessarily what has to be done in order to find a better way through. The press is able to provide context and analysis when it's at its best. But in my opinion, it fails its job when it instead simply chases popularity and clicks. Essentially, there are a few points to make. The third chamber of politics is here to stay, whether politicians like it or not. It's great to embrace it. We can use it judiciously to make an impact on politics, to contribute as citizens to the political process, and the press can make a contribution by analysing the political process. Ideally, it provides that layer of analysis and interpretation to the happenings of the day, joining the dots and offering insight and context into the daily melee and holding power to account. But it can also add a layer of stupid. It's often scurrilous, unprincipled, and self-serving. And in the 24-hour media cycle, it has become ravenous and more susceptible to sensationalisation. Same as it ever was, but faster. Understanding why that happens helps people who want to achieve good outcomes also feed back to the press what is acceptable and what is not. You, by your choices, decide whether the press is an organ of analysis or an organ to feed you the confirmation bias that it would like to serve up on its laziest days. Nonetheless, when it's good, it's a valuable resource for governments as well, which understand how to use it because it provides the benefits for governments which understand how to use it because it provides the benefits of a helicopter view and synthesized insights. It's an important first draft of history, but not, and this is crucial, a polished draft. We should all understand that journalists are actors in the political process, as much as the politicians who they showcase and bring to us. Politics is coloured by the thoughts of the people who present it, and in the final draft of history, those people will be judged as well. I hope that's a bit of an overview of the way the press delivers its third chamber and how we can all think about influencing the press to be the best it can be and politics to be held account by the people and the press that it needs so badly.
Thank you very much, Parnell. I know you go on for quite a long time because it's a fascinating subject. You've given some real insights, but we do have some questions. And I think I'll try and join them so we get a continuance of questions which you may be able to answer in a nutshell, hopefully, all being well. So just bear with me. I'm just checking these questions now. But, our president, Mark, if you'd like to ask your question, because yours came last in the list. So if you'd just like to ask your question of Parnell, that would be greatly appreciated. I have two more after that.
It's a really fascinating subject, I think. Thank you so much. And, I'm often wondering, my question is, how does the press draw the line between public interest and popularity, and whether that's even a decision to be made?
I think there's a little bit of both that is important. So obviously an unpopular article is one that's unread, but an interesting analysis presented in an engaging way has a chance of at least being discussed. So the problem is not the popularity of the article so much, I think, and this goes back to my favorite quote, well-behaved women seldom make history. I think the problem is when journalists decide that they want to be liked personally. which is often also the problem that we see in politics when the actors in policy and politics forget that there is a difference between being liked and being effective, and sometimes you have to take a bit of a dip to be effective.
Karen had a question. Karen, while Jeff's sort of looking around, would you like to put your question to Parnell?
Mark, do you mind reading it? Because I've got a neighbour upstairs who's drilling something.
Yep. Yeah,
Could
no
you do
problem.
that? Thanks.
Karen's question is about misinformation and how, you know, we draw the line between, well, freedom of speech, really. Where do we draw the line with freedom of speech?
I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? So, I mean, and we're seeing this at the moment in particular because we're in the middle of a situation in which science is evolving very, very quickly. And something which was information a few months ago is now misinformation. So, you know, for instance, there might have been a study which showed that a particular medication had some promise, but then over time, that study is superseded by other studies, and the information has become misinformation. But because people latch onto these things, so at some point, that because they stop evolving their own opinions and their identity becomes formed around a certain version of things, misinformation becomes this nugget of information becomes something that they can't let go of. So I think this is another reason why the press is so important, and I think often does a huge disservice by refusing to convey complexity, because it takes us to a position then when every message had to be perfect and whole from the very beginning. Now, life is not like that. Things change, and the press actually should be looking at what has changed, what they reported then, even when the reporting was wrong, why it was wrong. Unfortunately, it's very rarely reflective like that. So you'll see in Norman Swan's reporting, I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about that, because he's rarely gone back and said, you know what, that was the best stand of information at the time, but science changes and here we are now. And that really needs to happen for the people to be taken along on the journey.
Okay, Parnell, that's very comprehensive, but there's a few more. I'll just ask them in order, and maybe you can sort of condense them. Okay, from Karen. Karen wanted to know, we know the dangers of misinformation. Where would you draw the line for freedom of speech? Number one. From Shiva, what are your thoughts on the clamour for a royal commission into the Murdoch empire? That would be interesting. And ultimately, isn't the press a different business model? Right. And then Mark already asked his question, and David wants to know, where can I go for a real principled journalism you describe? Right now, and here's the last one. She's already asked one, so I'm going to put Glenn's 5 cents worth in. On the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the then censored picture of the falling man has been the subject of much discussion. How would such a distressing and traumatizing image be managed in today's digital social media? Should it have been managed in the first place? So there's a bit to go on with there, Parnell. If I could just leave it in your capable hand. You've got about 5
I've made notes, but you might need to remind me along the way. That list of questions. The Murdoch Press investigation, the Royal Commission. Look, personally, I'm not a massive fan. I think that it is right to question the way that things have been reported. It's also right to ask a media outlet, or to challenge a media outlet on a particular line. And it's undisputable in my view that News Corp has taken very strong lines on particular things. So for instance, just yesterday morning, there was a report that it's now going to be changing its reporting on climate change to support a 2050 target. And News Corp has carried a lot a lot of material that has been skeptical of climate change. But in a way, this is a great example of where they've gone from from reporting to campaigning, because it's not like you shouldn't report that there are questions in a scientific matter. It's simply the taking one view and prosecuting that relentlessly is potentially problematic. And I think, though, that people are themselves quite able to see what's going on there. So yes, some people do subscribe then to the News Corp view, but frankly, those people will also in this day and age find a lot of information online or misinformation online about these things, where I would be a little bit more questioning, and in fact I have, is about the reporting or what Turnbull would have called campaigning against him. So I mean, I think that I do think that we need more informed citizens. I'm not sure that a royal commission into News Corp would achieve a great deal. What are we going to do? Have a royal commission into the Saturday paper for having views in the other direction? You know, it's not every, you don't need a royal commission to tell you that different news outlets take different views. And, you know, and that kind of feeds into the question of where to with principled journalism. Well, everywhere, read everything. That's sort of the point, I think, that if you confine yourself to one outlet which tends to agree with you, that's when you end up with a skewed view of the world. So there are, you know, everybody's a bit wrong. There's no infallible journalist. There is no infallible politician. You have to balance these things. So principled journalism is about looking, you know, principled journalism is probably the best possible analysis that person could deliver. But it doesn't mean it's right. On 9/11, which is the next one I managed to get in my list, wasn't it an awful image? I don't know what the answer is to that one, honestly. I think there are some images which are so awful that we almost need to see them. It's like in the Vietnam War, the image of the man burning himself to death in protest. Movements have strong images. In this case, it was an incredibly distressing image, which, however, illustrated an incredibly distressing act. My only hesitation here is, of course, that there was a family attached to that, and that was their human falling out of the tower. And that's a distressing thought, that image is the image that's imprinted on all of us. But should you censor distressing happenings because they are distressing? Well, we can't censor the happening. So I think that there is a strong case for the image being seen as well.
Parnell, what a heritage of journalism you come from. So congratulations, and it certainly shows. You know, you've given us many points to ponder. Of course, the obvious one, that one cannot exist without the other, that's journalists and politicians. You talk about the act of journalism making politicians more presentable, and is there a balance? And most likely there is not. And that contentiousness that exists between journalists and politicians. The line about the hacks that hack them up is, I think, quite telling. But when we start to look at populism and the voice of the people, you have insisted that we need to question this. And I think we need to question actually everything as far as the rigor that's applied in some of the journalistic and political policies. I think the point that you make about the synthesized insights, the context and analysis that responsible journalism brings is something that we can all take away. And you're actually one of the instruments that help us all to connect the dots when they aren't clearly visible as connections. So when we distinguish between tabloid press and responsible principled journalism, again, question everything. I mean, that's certainly something that I'm taking away. And it takes a lot of courage on both sides, on the political side, on the policy side, as well as on the journalist side. And we want to thank you for taking that courageous, ongoing mission. So as a thank you from Rotary Club of Sydney, we'd like to dedicate in your honor $100 towards our international project, which is Rotary Give Every Child a Future, where we are going to vaccinate 100,000 children in 9 Pacific Island countries. So thank you again for waking us all up, Parnell. Very much appreciate it.